Alright, back at it again with another Ch0pper video. Okay.
Elden Ring, a video game that was just very recently rewarded with the Game of the Year, and well-deserved, but has completely changed the perception of open-world games and what can be done with them forever.
Yep.
I think this game took many people by surprise. This introduced a whole new audience to FromSoft and their unique approach to game design, in which it's fundamentally a game that introduces you to unknown and seemingly impossible and immovable objects and lets you learn and figure out a way to eventually overcome those obstacles. Combine that with the spirit of the open world game approach, and this is not the typical open world design that you would likely expect. Honestly,
Best armor set in the game right there. Not just in terms of how good it is against holy damage, but also just with how it looks. It looks badass. But yeah, I think with the way that FromSoft designed Elden Ring and the way Miyazaki envisioned his open world, a lot of people thought it was just going to be Dark Souls, but bigger. And we weren't entirely wrong, but it also blew us away with how big it and interconnected it actually was. Because you can go to 99% of the entire map almost from the very beginning. I don't recommend it because everything's going to kick your ass outside of Limgrave. But then there are even things in Limgrave that can still kick your ass.
Honestly, it's an extremely bizarre concept for a game to begin with, but it works shockingly well. When the entire experience is crystallized, Elden Ring is basically an open-world Dark Souls game until it's not, and I'll explain what I mean by that later in the video.
Yeah, it's an open-world Dark Souls game until it's not. There is a lot of problems with Elden Ring in the end game specifically. But that's been a problem with almost every FromSoft game.
But as an honorary member of the embarrassing man-child community myself, who attended college for a whole year, I am therefore required by law to make a giant video essay about Elden Ring, and why it's a masterpiece with some clear blemishes and imperfections.
Babe, wake up. New video essay on a subject I literally don't care about just dropped.
The main things I really want to focus on are the game structure and how the open world interacts with the player and therefore the world, a little bit of the storytelling, and also how the combat and how builds play a role in the experience, and of course, the bread and butter of FromSoft games, the bosses.
Yep.
Keep in mind, I'm not going to talk about every single boss in this game as there are just far too many.
There are 165 bosses. And by 165 bosses, I mean there's like 20 or 30 unique bosses, and then the rest are copy-paste. Which, I personally, I don't care. Just for me, personally. Like, yes, I wish there were some sort of new, unique bosses that, were kind of scattered around that would actually be worth finding, but at the same time, there's only so much you can do when you're crunching together a 4-year project that is Elden Ring.
But I am going to talk about the most noteworthy of them, or any others that I actually have something to say about, and all the bosses that I discuss will have their own dedicated sections as well. With all of that said, Elden Ring is easily one of my favorite games of all time. Its fundamentals
True.
are super solid despite this weird and brand new spin on a formula, and despite all its problems, I truly think that this will be one of the games that defines a generation.
Absolutely. I think Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3 specifically have really opened up the eyes of a lot of gamers who have been nothing but shoveling shit into their mouths for the past decade. And realized that these are what video games are supposed to be like. They're not supposed to be these microtransaction battle pass hells that you can't escape. Like, they're fucking putting battle passes and shit in sports games at this point. We are in the future. We are approaching a future where no game is microtransaction free and no game is simply a one-time purchase ever again. Like we are fast approaching that point. And I unfortunately have to sit here and live it.
Mark my words, I only think Elden Ring is going to get looked at more and more fondly as time passes, but in some sense, I think all of that is justified. It's a wonderful example that games are still being massively innovative in current day. I know it's easy to get into the mindset that games don't innovate or push boundaries anymore, but Elden Ring proves that that is not the case in flying colors.
FromSoft has been pushing boundaries since day one. Since Demon's Souls, they have been pushing the boundaries of game design from the very beginning. And a lot of it has to do with Miyazaki being a fucking genius. But also, you have to understand that FromSoft is full of some of the most talented game developers in the world. I don't know what kind of stuff they're on, but they basically shit out gold every single time. If it's Dark Souls 2, it's bronze.
Having said that, no game is ever truly perfect, and as I always say, you don't even really want a perfect game either,
No.
because then we'd have nothing to complain about endlessly on the internet. But on a more serious note, my critiques and criticisms of certain components of the game are born out of a passion for the experience and how it might be made better. So we're going to cover it all.
That's why I love the Elden Ring modding community, because there are a bunch of people, including myself. I don't get me wrong, I'm not super affiliated with people, but being around these people and seeing the kind of passions that are going into different mods that they've been making, it's very clear to me that they are of the same mindset that I'm in, as I understand the limitations that some things in Elden Ring have, and I can see which boundaries we can push and which things we can switch around and change around for other things. For example, the Convergence mod developers are fucking insane with how much they want to fundamentally change the game and how much better the Convergence is than vanilla Elden Ring. And I didn't think that was possible for a long time. I had my doubts about the Convergence mod for a very, very long time. I thought there was no way that it could be better than vanilla Elden Ring. Holy shit, was I wrong. I put more hours into Elden Ring for much longer and for a longer period of time than I have since I've been playing Elden Ring.
All the good, the bad, and the terrible all the same. So if you want to hear a guy in his mid-20s make a video essay on a game he really loves, then get comfortable and join me as we dive into the experience that is Elden Ring.
Let's do it.
Let me be honest with you right out of the gate and set the stage here. This is a personal opinion of mine, but I've never been the biggest fan of open world style games.
Me either.
I don't have anything against them at all, and I've played countless versions of slightly different flavors of the open world format, but nothing was really quite doing it for me. Never was really big on the open world gameplay of Assassin's Creed or Uncharted with its open world elements. No Man's Sky wasn't really my vibe, and maybe this is blasphemous to say, but I really didn't enjoy Breath of the Wild all that much.
My man. I will say, however, that Elden Ring's biggest inspiration, I would say, is Breath of the Wild. It's just that Elden Ring is the better Breath of the Wild. I'm just gonna say it right now. To be fair, I am not a big Zelda fan. I've never been a big Zelda fan. I don't care for any of the games. I understand. Now, it's one of those parts where I understand why people like them, but it's just not for me. Like, I just don't get it.
On the contrary, I had a great time with all of the other more linear Zelda games before, but something about how open world was handled in video games up to this point just didn't really have me bricked in the way that it probably should. Let me be clear, those, all the games I just mentioned are wonderful video games, but subjectively, the open world wasn't really doing it for me. Then Elden Ring came along and completely redefined what the buzzword open world really meant to me. But you may ask, what's the difference? I'll explore that in detail later in a moment, but I want to
You dodged way too early.
say that the open-ended structure is its greatest asset and biggest liability.
You need to jump those first two.
The way the game's built is such a double-edged sword, and in some cases, that is literally true.
That's the best weapon in the game right there. It's actually funny how ridiculously good the Twin Blade is. I'm going to gush about almost every aspect of this. Is going to be a 2-hour-long video because I keep pausing because there's just so much I love to talk about with Elden Ring. It is so ridiculously hilarious to me how good the regular smithing stone Twin Blade, this one, is. It's so good. It's so good. It has such a wide variety of ashes of war that you can put on it. You can use greases. You can use spell buffs. You can use everything with it. And it mixes with almost every armor type. It is probably one of the best dex weapons in the game. And even though I'm not a big fan of base Elden Ring's keen scaling, if you put keen on this weapon, it will carry you through almost through the rest of the game. The only twin blade that's better than this one is Eleonora's pole blade in the base game. And the only reason the pole blade is better is because it's basically the twin-bladed version of Rivers of Blood.
True. The positive element is that the game is so expansive that you'll never feel you've really mastered it all or have seen every inch of what it has to offer. There's
Unless you're me.
always something you probably haven't encountered, and that keeps the game interesting and exciting. On the other hand, this also means that every player is likely going to have a largely different experience to someone else. Your entire perception of this game is pretty much determined by how you choose to interact with it. Again, that is one of its biggest strengths. It's incredibly rewarding to feel like you accomplished something without the game throwing you freebies and really having agency over how the game plays out. And you can go about doing that in virtually unlimited ways. But the downside is you're almost guaranteed to miss huge swaths of the game if you're not going out of your way to, look stuff up or really take your time exploring everything.
That is a huge problem. My very first playthrough was completely blind, and I missed almost everything. I missed, half of the Remembrance bosses. I didn't even fight the Regal Ancestor. I didn't fight Estelle. I didn't fight Moog. I fought Melania, obviously, so that doesn't count. What else did I miss? I'm not sure. There's a lot of stuff that I missed. I can barely remember my first playthrough. The only thing I remember about my first playthrough is it was similar to what I did for my Let's Play. I was about to say role play there for a second. Whoops. My Let's Play, which was a katana build, and I ended up not using the Crucible Axe armor, but it was the Crucible Tree armor instead, because I didn't know where the Axe armor was at that point. I didn't even know it existed. I didn't find that out until 2 or 3 playthroughs later. It took me at least 10 different playthroughs to fully figure out where almost everything is. The reason why in my Convergence videos when I'm playing, I know where things are, is because I've played the game so much. I have it imprinted in my brain where almost everything is. Almost. There are some caves I've never been in. There are some areas that I've never touched because it doesn't have anything that interests me. But the main reason why I have to know where everything is now is because the Convergence does things differently.
Like in God of War, as an example, while you'll have a slightly different experience depending on what you do, ultimately you have to hit the same main beats as everyone else.
Yeah, that's actually really funny. I've been playing this again recently. I put in like, fuck, how many hours did I put into God of War recently? I put in another 50 hours in God of War. The reason why my hours are reset is because this is a new account. Like, for those of you who don't know, I lost my Steam account to a phishing website. So they fished out my information and they stole my old Steam account. Um, so it's just kind of lost. But I got most of my games back and it didn't really matter. The only thing I lost was my save files. So that sucked. But yeah, I've been playing the shit out of God of War 2018 because it's the only one on PC. Mm. Also, what a noob. He's using the light arrows on a single target. That doesn't stun very well.
There's much less variation in experience from person to person. You might go about it slightly differently, but you're...
The only thing that changes the way you play God of War 2018 is your armors. And generally, most people end up with the same armor set because some armor sets are better than others. I don't mess around with cooldown at all when I play God of War because if I'm not doing enough damage to facilitate using my runic attacks, then I'm not going to be worrying about how fast they recharge. Now, when it's New Game Plus, however, that's when the game changes. Because you not only have higher stat ceilings, but also then you need to start worrying about how many runic attacks you can get off. Because the enemies are harder, they stun less, and you generally you have better access with other things too.
Overall experience is going to be pretty similar to most people's. Elden Ring is the exact opposite. So, for example, my first ever playthrough of this game, I deliberately avoided watching any videos or looking stuff up, totally blind experience,
True.
and it was awesome going at it like that.
It's the best way to experience your first FromSoft game or your first playthrough of a new FromSoft game. It's the same thing I'm going to do with Shadow of the Erdtree whenever it decides to come out, which, with the way things are going, I'm expecting it's not till next year. But it's one of the best ways to experience a new FromSoft game. Go completely blind, don't look up anything, don't take any advice, do it by yourself, and do it by yourself. Like, I know there's a lot of streamers that like to stream their first experiences. The chat, if you're going to do that, disable your chat. Don't look at your chat. Do it by yourself. Forget you're streaming if you're streaming it.
Don't get me wrong, but I missed so much important stuff that I was on the very edge of, but didn't experience because the game is just so damn big. And I didn't even know Renala's boss fight existed at all until after I beat the game. This is...
Really? You skipped Renala? But she's so easy.
It's like the third main boss you're supposed to encounter, and I missed it entirely. To some degree, that's probably my fault, but I also think that's the open world structure working against itself counterintuitively, and that can, you know, cause these large discrepancies in, like, subjective enjoyment, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The point is, the open world Elden Ring is distinct for comes with some real advantages and drawbacks. I think the strongest case for the open world design is shown in the early to mid game. You know, everything from Limgrave to Liurnia, Caelid, and possibly even up to Altus Plateau. This is where the game shines the most, in my opinion.
That is very true. Everything that is interconnected, all the way from Limgrave, Caelid, Liurnia, and Altus, all of those areas are, they're perfect. They're absolutely spot on perfect with the way they're interconnected, with the way they're set up and structure. All of it is perfect. It's the stuff after that where things kind of fall apart.
There was a lot of attention to detail about how the player is likely going to interact with the actual game for the first few hours outside of the predetermined little intro bit. A first-time player is likely going to step outside, have an encounter with the tree sentinel, and get absolutely blown up if you're not expecting it. And this tells you two things. Number one, you're not as strong as you think you are, and two, there are smaller fish to fry before you go and try this again.
And if you're me, you beat your head against Tree Sentinel for 6 hours.
The game gently guides you along to find more gray spots and slowly introduces you to new mechanics for progression. FromSoft has always been a little bit opaque when describing how things are supposed to work, but most players grasp the ideas and concepts pretty quickly.
That's the way they design it. It's designed to lay out the groundwork and let the player figure it out. It's designed completely around player agency, which is not how most open world games are anymore, because open world games, even now, aren't truly open world because there's a lot of linearity to a lot of different things that lays it out for the player. The player doesn't have to figure anything out.
You can kill enemies, get stuff, and turn that stuff into runes or usable equipment to get stronger. And after watching some of my real-life, like, non-hardcore gamer friends play this, I believe what works is that it shows you just what you need to know, but makes a real point to not hold your hand at any time, despite being an open-world game. One of the best things about Elden Ring's open-world format is that there are no...
You don't even have the stat requirements for that weapon. Why are you using it? If you're using it, why aren't you two-handing it? Sorry.
Objective markers. Again, as much as I like God of War, the thing that discouraged me from exploring much of its side content was the fact that the main objective was always telling you where you're supposed to be, and
this is a big problem with Ragnarok from what I've seen, is that you always have the characters nagging you about the stuff that you need to be doing that you don't really have time to go and find what you want. Ragnarok is much more open world than 2018. I still haven't played it because it's not on PC.
It was always on screen. Not only did it feel a little hand-holdy at times, but it also subconsciously made exploring the other stuff feel a little pointless or boring or a little inconvenient because you know the good stuff the game has to offer is just staring you in the face. Which, look, there's a time and place for that for sure. God of War is a very accessible game, and that is to be celebrated. But I'm not gonna lie, it was so refreshing having a game where it's not constantly telling me what I need to be doing.
There's a strat. Damn, I haven't seen someone use the ledge strat in forever. I haven't used this strat in forever because you can just roll right through it if you time it right.
In fact, there are virtually no objective markers in the game, period.
I think he's confused. I don't think he understands.
There's arguably, a couple. There's one or two, like after you beat Radon, there's one showing you that a new area was unlocked, and you should probably check it out, but nowhere on screen does it outright tell you that. The game gently funnels you, into the initial natural progression that they intended. For example, you've fought in Limgrave for a while, you've explored a good chunk of it, and maybe you're feeling a little bit confident in that you've mastered it all. And because of its relative position, it's very likely that a new player at some point is going to stumble into the nightmare hellscape world that is Caelid.
Oh, this is one of my problems with the game, is that Caelid is so accessible. Well, there's two problems that I have with the beginning game experience. Number one, Margit is way too hard of a boss fight for the beginning of the game. You have to massively overlevel for Margit if you're not very experienced. But if you're also not careful, you can end up here and get your ass blasted by everything.
AKA Florida. If you end up here as a low-level player, you're swiftly slapped in the face, and your ego down with it. The game is showing you you're not ready for this. Come back later. But in the back of your mind, you now have realized that there's a whole new world just waiting to be explored when you're a little bit farther along. And at some point in your early journey, you're also likely going to encounter the first real boss, Margit the Fell Omen.
Emboldened by the flame of ambition.
Foul
And if Florida
tarnished.
made you feel insignificant, Margit makes you feel like dust. Unless you've already practiced the fight or know how it works, Margit was literally made to smack down players that haven't thoroughly enough explored the world yet. Margit's a great checkpoint for making sure that you've interacted with the game enough just to understand the basics, and you've leveled up a bit, maybe cleared some dungeons, or killed that damn tree sentinel that was giving you hell before, and so on. I think
Tree Sentinel isn't even worth killing, because he only gives you like 3,000 runes. But at the same time, it's worth killing him because Tree Sentinel is one of the most used movesets in the whole game. If you know how to fight Tree Sentinel, you know how to fight the double Tree Sentinel. If you know how to fight Tree Sentinel, you can fight Draconic Tree Sentinel. If you know how to fight them, you can fight the Night Cavalry. Stuff like that.
Everything from Limgrave past Stormhill Shack and up until you beat Godric, the way the open world flows and how it relates to your progression is so beautifully crafted, super meticulous and well thought out.
I think, unironically, Castle Morn is one of the best locations in the whole game.
After you get to Liurnia, though, the game opens up to you a little bit, but this also means that the more careful and thought-out craft of the experience starts to fade away. This is the point where a player's experience is likely going to diverge greatly from others. And if there's something I really want to drive home in this video, it's this. Due to the nature of the RPG element,
God, this boss sucks.
that different builds provide and how, they interact with main parts of the game and the additional options of like summons and boss fights, etc. It's impossible for FromSoft to design a game that's optimal for every combination of gear and playstyle that somebody might want to approach with. This means that there's this zone of optimal progression that ensures you'll have a pretty good experience.
This guy knows how to play. Well, somewhat. I think there's some things that he's kind of missing here. Like, you can two-hand that and use Oath of Vengeance. You know Oath of Vengeance is one of the best Ash of Wars in the game, right? For those of you who don't know, Oath of Vengeance, basically you take a stance and it ups all of your stats by like 2 or 3. So all of your stats go up. I think it's like a 30-second buff. But also, you should be two-handing this weapon. Or power stancing it with another ultra greatsword. And jump attack spam. But the reason why I say this guy knows how to play is because his flasks, one flask heals all of his health. He went from 0 to full. Like, you see his health?
Is that there's this zone of optimal progression that ensures you'll
He
have
went from
approach
0
with.
to full.
This means that there's this zone of optimal progression that ensures you'll have a pretty good experience, but anything on the fringes or really vastly different methods and playstyles will cause these massive discrepancies in player experience. This is the main reason that not having a difficulty slider works, because in some sense, the difficulty options are baked within the mechanics of the game.
Your difficulty is... the game is as hard as you want it to be. The game is as hard as you want it to be. Now, at certain points, the game is defaulting a difficulty, which, again, is kind of the problem with the end game. But for the most part, you can out-level or out-gear everything in the game. If you really want to. You can, and it's very possible.
And how you choose to engage with them. In short, literally everyone's going to have a different experience with Elden Ring, for better or for worse. So while I don't claim the game is perfect, I do think FromSoft does an excellent job at accounting for the relative scale of their game for the most part.
Before we begin, allow me to paint you the full picture.
Uh-oh.
Now, before we continue talking about gameplay and the open world structure, I want to quickly touch on story and narrative. One pretty common complaint about Elden Ring I will hear is that from a story perspective, the game is disjointed, weak, and not very interesting. And while I disagree with that sentiment,
that is totally wrong, and it's coming from people who are so used to having the story force-fed into them. Read your item descriptions, look at the environment, and watch every cutscene. It's all connected. Or If you want it to be force-fed to you, go watch Vati.
It is a valid criticism. I'm going to use God of War as an example again, since I basically played these two games side by side. God of War also literally won the award for Best Narrative, and again,
Yes, as it should have.
I don't disagree with it. God of War has an excellent story, but the difference between God of War and Elden Ring's story is not how much, is or isn't there. It's the method of delivery that's totally different between these two titles.
It's the same type of storytelling that they've had since Demon Souls. The story is there, you just have to look for it. It's not some master-crafted, dialogue-driven epic that God of War 2018 and Ragnarok are. It's this massive journey. It's the journey that matters. It doesn't matter what... Ultimately, the cutscenes don't matter as long as you are experiencing the trial and tribulation of your journey. And the reason why they do that is because these games are under a specific archetype of gaming called RPGs. Role-playing games. The reason why they write the story that way is so that you, the player, can insert yourself into the story and be fully immersed. In the story of these games, you are the chosen undead. You are the bearer of the curse. You are the Ashen One. You are the tarnished who would be Lord. They make these stories so the player is the main character. And sometimes the player isn't even the main character, if we're talking about Dark Souls, because the chosen undead is just a pawn in a bigger game that was laid out by Gwyn. In Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse is again just another undead who happened to succeed. The Ashen One is just another undead who happened to claim all of the souls, all of the souls of Cinder. Lords of Cinder, my bad. I need to play Dark Souls 3 again. In Elden Ring, your literal objective is claim great runes, become Elden Lord. That's it. Those are the two things that are explicitly told to you. Claim great runes, become Elden Lord. It's simple. Now, in the end, you end up having to kill God in every single one of these games, because that's just how it happens. Basically, they set you out on an objective, and then eventually they ramp it up and say, okay, now go kill God. Become God is basically what they want you to do. That's basically every Souls game ever. It's if you want to boil it down to simplicity. I love it. It's amazing.
God of War's narrative is very straightforward, and it's excellent at what it does. It's a traditional 3-act structure with, a clear beginning, middle, and end. Has classic story beats that you'd expect, and
it has the classic hero's journey. Except it shifts who the hero is depending on who we're focusing on. In all of God of War 2018, it's about Kratos and Atreus' journey together. In God of War Ragnarok, it's less about Kratos and more about Atreus trying to figure out who he is and what he needs to be doing.
Has a satisfactory ending. There's lots of cutscenes, tons of character dialogue and interactions, and it's an interactive movie in some sense. Not even saying that's a bad thing in that case specifically, because it's so well done.
Yeah, you're not wrong. God of War is kind of like an interactive movie in some sense. If only it wasn't brutally difficult in a lot of sense. To be fair, God of War, opposed to Elden Ring and all Souls-like, God of War has a difficulty selection. It's just that me as a gamer, I refuse to not play anything on either the second hardest or the hardest difficulty.
Elden Ring, however, its storytelling is done through details in the world. FromSoft slapped the homie George R.R. Martin's name on this project, knowing full well people are familiar with his other work like Game of Thrones, etc., but the extent that he was involved in the storytelling is questionable at best.
It's minimal. They basically told him to make an outline. Wasn't there an interview with George R.R. Martin where he said they approached him and they asked him to make an outline for their video game, and he gave them some story points, and that's what they ran with? Isn't that the extent of what George R.R. Martin did? Don't get me wrong. I think George R.R. Martin is one of the best story writers of our for a long time. He's one of the greatest writers to have ever lived. But at the same time, I don't think he did very much for the game itself. I think he gave them some story points, and he wrote a lot of the family dynamics over the different demigods and whatnot. But other than that, I don't think he did much.
He seems so disconnected from the final product of Elden Ring when you hear him talk about it.
I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer.
This
the
interview
game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls. My work on it was actually done years ago.
You can definitely feel the George R.R. Martin influence smeared all over this game, but the depth in the lore that it reaches is kind of debatable, so I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert on the subject, but Elden Ring has a fairly deep lore, and knowing the basic backstory will enhance your gameplay experience tremendously. The key thing is, the story is told through small bits and clues throughout your journey. You really gotta go digging for it. It's there, just waiting to be uncovered, which, you know, that's pretty much the attitude that the rest of the game takes on. I love this method of storytelling in the proper context. It reminds me very much of like old school COD Zombies in a way, where it's got an unbelievably deep and intricate story, but you're only given parts of it, you know, through radio messages that you'll discover occasionally, or a cipher that needs to be decoded, or just subtle details about the environment that will get you speculating. That's exactly the principle on which Elden Ring operates on. If you're really curious and intrigued by the narrative, then you'll uncover some clues that, you know, will enlighten the story that isn't so obvious to the casual observer. In fact, you might even just miss main key characters entirely if you're not paying attention, like Alexander the Jar. You don't necessarily need to interact with very many people at all, just like gamers do in real life. But my ultimate point is, one method of storytelling isn't superior to the other, they're just different. There's times where I like a more straightforward and crafted story to get invested in, and then there's other times where I prefer the show don't tell approach as well. That's why I don't even really find it useful to compare the story of God of War or any other traditional story game to Elden Ring.
There's no point in comparing them since they're not even remotely close to being the same. They are completely different types of writings, and you shouldn't compare them at all. For example, I'm going to throw myself under the bus here. My story writing is probably closer to the way God of War's story is written than the way Elden Ring is written. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of words. There's a lot of influence that I've inspiration, that's the word I'm looking for. Jesus Christ, my brain melted. There's a lot of inspiration from the Dark Souls series, from the Souls series of every game, with the way that I drop certain clues into the way I write. But at the same time, it's a more straightforward and told out story. But there's also plenty of mystery that's left up to the imagination, because I won't answer those questions.
They're not the same, and they're not trying to be. It's really a matter of taste and personal preference at the end of the day. But the last thing I want to say about story, because it's not really my focus for why I wanted to make this video, your experience can be totally altered when you know generally what's going on and why. It gives purpose to the enemies you fight and places you visit. While Elden Ring narratively on a surface level does come across as kind of disconnected nonsense, the pieces to put the general picture together are there if you go out of your way to look for it.
I think the lore around all of the bosses make the bosses infinitely more interesting. It makes it so much more fun to fight them. Like, Radahn. Radahn is one of the greatest bosses in the entirety of Elden Ring, and just knowing his lore makes it infinitely more awesome to fight him. But it also makes you wonder, how strong was he before he lost his mind? Because what you're fighting in the game is not even close to how he was fighting Melania.
Really help you appreciate the world and events that much more if you choose to do so.
The fallen leaves tell a story.
You want to do something crazy right now? Hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying the video. We're trying to hit 1 million runes on this channel. You know, 1 sub equals 1 rune, and we're really trying to level up. So if y'all want to help out, it's greatly appreciated, and thank you so much. So, back to the gameplay. I've realized that Elden Ring is more or less divided into 3 acts, just like any other game, but it's done in a much less obvious way. I really see the first act as the intro bit throughout all of Limgrave and possibly up until you beat Rennala or maybe even Radahn. The second...
I would say the intro of the game is all of Limgrave, all of Liurnia, and Radahn is Act 2. If you want me to be... I think beating Rennala is the end of the first act, and I think beating Radahn is around Act 2.
Second act is the meat and potatoes of Elden Ring's gameplay, and where the core gameplay loop is the most expansive and obvious. This covers everything from Liurnia to Volcano Manor, Altus Plateau, the capital, the snow areas, and so on. The third act of the game, the entire open world concept just falls out. The game takes a super hard shift in design and structure, but we're going to talk about more of that later. But
yes.
Shall we say the main bread and butter of Elden Ring specifically, and what makes that unique, is essentially all done in the first and second act. This is where you get the most accelerated character progression and exploration. One of the aspects that makes Elden Ring's open world so unique is the fact that it genuinely doesn't care about how much of the game you do or do not see. There's always this feeling in the back of my mind in most open world games that while it gives you the appearance of a true freeform layout, there are subtle tricks and design choices that will lead you to one spot or another. Elden Ring has some of these for sure. You know, some of the lighting that leads you towards dungeons and other areas, contrasts and colors to show you like golden trees and so on, but really how much of the game you interact with is totally up to you at the end of the day. This is shown very apparently in the game's dozens of dungeons and secret caves and other areas. While this massive array of places to go and do is a good thing, it also has the drawback of feeling repetitive or monotonous if examined too much.
Yes.
For example, Miyazaki fully intended that most players will not go out of their way to explore every area of the map inch by inch.
Yeah.
You are literally not supposed to even. I believe the main idea behind the design here is that the average player is going to run to a very normal amount, giving them challenges and tons of enemy variety, but when taken to its extremes and exploring every area, you realize how much content is copy-pasted into one another. However, I will say I think that's largely a problem for more hardcore players only.
Yes, it is a much bigger problem for a hardcore player to do everything, myself, than it is for the average player. I think if you're the average player, you're going to have a much better experience with Elden Ring than I do. Because I have to do every single dungeon, I have to do every single location, because I'm an OCD freak, and I have to do everything.
And I'm considering you watching this video a hardcore player in this case. I'm saying the average player isn't someone who even really goes out of their way to watch YouTube videos and stuff. You know, for the normal gamer who's just gonna pick up and play occasionally, this formula works almost perfectly. But any more dedicated players like us will start to see the copy-paste really take a toll on the overall quality of the game.
Yep.
Bosses getting cheaply, turned over and easily reused in dungeons again and again can start to lose the charm they once had. Doing too many dungeons in the early or mid-game can also dampen the late-game experience. You might encounter a boss in a less serious encounter before you fight the mandatory one, but more importantly, this non-structure has huge implications on the main meat of the game. At the point where the game really lets you on your own, it's very common that you'll end up at some of the main bosses eventually being absurdly over-leveled and just demolish them without a second thought, or fight bosses in which you're so unbelievably under-leveled that you're getting consistent.
I hate that fucking
one-shot
attack. I hate that big wave attack. He got one shot? Wait, what?
In which you're so unbelievably under-leveled that you're getting consistently one-shot.
Good God! But yeah, I hate that big wave attack that the god that that the fucking that this boss does. I hate that wave because you have to run as fast as you can. The moment he telegraphs, you have to run to either side as fast as you can and jump before he unleashes the wave. It's one of the hardest moves to dodge.
By almost all their moves. It's a very common occurrence. Now, you might say this is a good thing, as it rewards players who deliberately do more exploration and come better prepared, and that's fair enough as an argument. However, it doesn't account for the fact that there's, again, this zone of optimal challenge that FromSoft would generally like you to have with these bosses, since they are essentially the main content of the game.
Yes.
So spoiling main content for the sake of side content is really the issue we face here. And the deeper you go, the more intense this problem becomes. This and the fact that some areas require you to solve puzzles to access or just in downright weird places, the game is practically screaming at you that you're not supposed to scour every inch of the map as you play, and that the goal is still the same whether you're over-leveled or not. The core gameplay loop is essentially defeating enemies, gathering items, and enhancing them at a central hub, aka the round table area. On your journey in the lands between, you might do some puzzles,
Your
kill a
life
few
literally
summer ants along the way,
is as valuable as a summer ant.
they stop at some shops, and this is where you're likely to have some of the most enjoyment out of Elden Ring. The feeling of progressing your character and how that reflects in the world, you can tangibly see yourself getting stronger, and the enemies you encounter is very clearly shown. You might level up a bit and go back and completely decimate a mini-boss that was giving you a lot of issues before and stuff like that, but Elden Ring is so loose in this aspect as to how you approach it. However, another drawback to all this is the redundancy of the dungeon layouts themselves and the rewards you get. Mostly all the dungeons in Elden Ring consist of more or less different flavors of this general outline. You might have an odd puzzle here and there sometimes, but the majority of these, the stone tomb aesthetic, is pretty much all the same, and the objective is to find and turn a lever to unlock the boss fight is virtually...
It's the same thing as the Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne. The thing about Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, the way I understand that they work, we're going to be watching the Bloodborne video after this. The way I understand the way the Chalice dungeons work, there are some of them that are preset, that are set in a certain way, but the rest of them are randomized. It's exactly the same as the way Elden Ring handled their catacombs and their caves.
All similar across every dungeon. Worse yet, most of the time, because of the huge number of these places, the odds that you get an item that's actually relevant to your build is almost zero. Not only that, but is probably inaccessible for the rest of your playthrough. Sure, you can sell these things, but it hardly feels worth it considering the time required to clear the dungeons and obtain said item.
Unless you're going for achievements, there's no point in doing them.
Now, occasionally a dungeon will do something you don't expect, like, for example, the Mount Gelmir Hero's Grave. This is essentially one giant meticulous puzzle that is so different from all the others that is a great refresher, or some may take you to a completely new area of the map upon completing them and coming out the other side, something totally unexpected, and there's absolutely something to be said for that. All in all, these dungeons and the repetitive nature of them may eventually start to wear on you a little bit, especially if they're interconnected with side quests, which is another aspect of the game I don't particularly love. While some are better than others, side quests for characters can often be just a vague description of where to go and what to do, and unless you look them up, they often end in you forgetting about what you were supposed to do and just carrying on about, your typical day. A few of the quest lines are more or less required to access certain parts of the game, like Mogwin Palace and whatnot, with just how...
Nope. Mogwin, you can go there whenever you want. You can very, very easily, you can very, very easily get to Moog without doing Vare's quest. You don't have to do Vare's quest. I've never done Vare's quest. Never done it.
How big the game really is, it can make quest lines a bit of a nightmare if they become disorganized, or if you accidentally kill off an NPC you didn't know you needed or something like that. It can get kind of messy. While they're by no means required to beat the game, a few of the quest lines are so chore-like that I'd actually rather do my laundry and clean the dishes in real life than do some of these. Now, the big thing that sets Elden Ring and FromSoft games apart from a typical adventure open world thing like this is their handling of combat. And Elden Ring's combat pacing is usually really solid, but not without its faults either. This will become more clear when we get into bosses, but the combat pacing of Elden Ring I'd say is most similar to Dark Souls 3. The core combat of these games have generally sped up over the years, but the core idea has always been about like finding gaps in your opponent's strategy and punishing vulnerable windows when they're open. But the interesting thing is in Elden Ring, because of the huge variety in builds and weapons and the ways that these can be used, there's a lot of discrepancy and mismatch when it comes to some encounters. This means people may have really good or really bad experience with some particular bosses. I noticed this very clearly upon repeat playthroughs. There's certain enemies and bosses where the pacing of the player feels like it's from a totally different game and therefore set of rules compared to said boss. And occasionally this can have the effect where it feels like you have to wait for an enemy to make like 5 or 6 moves before you can push any buttons.
I felt this way whenever I tried to do my magic build. I feel like that's something that's I feel like that's something that's especially obvious when you're doing anything that isn't close-up melee combat. Because you do have to wait for opportunities in melee. But at the same time, if you use ranged, you're not even going to have to worry about most of the boss's moveset. You just have to stay at a distance.
While it's a mixed bag, I have to say most of the fights in Elden Ring really do feel fair, much like a reactive give-and-take kind of dance, where you can feel engaged in that flow state as you learn and respond to moves. And other times...
He finally used it!
You can feel engaged in that flow state as you learn and respond to moves.
Boom! That's Oath of Vengeance. All of his stats just went up.
And other times, it just feels like you're kind of baiting an AI to spam the same moves over and over again so you can get in one hit and just repeating the process until the health bar reaches 0.
That is very much the case for all of the harder bosses.
Much less engaging and way more autopilot-y. We'll come back to combat more thoroughly once we get to bosses in more detail and also how build variety interacts with that as well, and even just every other aspect of the game. But now I do want to mention how each area of the game feels and plays distinctly different. This is a massive compliment to the world building and art direction.
Okay, sorry about that.
Somehow, they managed to make like, I don't know, 9 or 10 different spaces and playstyles feel and play completely differently from each other, including the underground areas and secret sections. The color palette and music tracks alongside its visuals give every area a really strong sense of identity. While you might say the variety in enemy types and dungeon layouts can get slightly repetitive, the aesthetic quality of each playable area make the game feel totally novel and really fresh every so often. The sheer style and vibe of everything that you interact with is such a large part of what make this massive game not tiresome or boring to play. Volcano Manor, Moguin Palace, Caelid, all the underground areas, and Altus Plateau are some of the most impressive and pleasing things to look at in all of gaming, and that and the potential puzzles and shortcuts baked into them, like the medallions you can build and bridges to get around on more effectively. The only region in the game that I feel is a little underdeveloped from a design and artistic standpoint is the mountaintop of the giant snowy area and the secret consecrated snowfield region.
These
feel significantly...
I think they are the most unfinished and unbaked parts of the game, but at the same time, they're still really good.
More spacey and empty compared to the prior locations. Altus Plateau suffers from this problem a little bit, but not as bad as this snowy area. Even the enemies are almost all borrowed from other areas of the game, making this one feel a little bit less special and distinct. Besides a couple of, really key moments here and there, like the giant Game of Thrones wall or this massive chain that connecting these two spaces that's visually a treat, but for some reason, this entire snow region is the most uninteresting part of the game visually and otherwise by a mile, and it's right at the end of the second act of the game. And it's ironic because the part where Elden Ring stops being open world is actually where the open world itself is the most lifeless. After defeating the main boss here, there is a hard shift in Elden Ring's gameplay. By this point, you've done basically all of the main map areas, defeated several bosses, explored vast and unique areas, and covered a lot of ground in doing so. There will be tons of sites of grace on your map, and you'll have a pretty solid grasp on the open world's overall functions. Then, after burning the Earth Tree and coming to the crumbling Far Missoula, Elden Ring structurally becomes more a traditional Souls game as far as layout.
Yep.
What you'll notice right away is two things. Number one, that the area is significantly smaller. There's way fewer sites of grace than before, and the dungeon and Everjail exploring is totally gone. And second, there's a massive difficulty spike here that's way more dramatic than any other region transition. It's a giant equalizer, and because it's way more linear from this point onwards, if you are for some reason underleveled or ill-prepared for this part, you'll know right away. And in a roundabout way, the last act of the game kind of feels like the beginning in the sense that your encounters are going to be far more consistent again. Bosses have a very particular order too, so it's hard to really be over or under leveled dramatically from boss to boss like you were maybe earlier in the game. The problem here, as far as I can tell, is not the difficulty increase per se, more that the time between hard battles is almost zero. You go through the absolute gauntlet of some of the most trying and difficult bosses in Elden Ring in a span of like, I don't know, a couple of hours, when maybe that time to face that...
I think that's the best part, is that you don't have to waste so much time fighting the bosses. I think that's the reason why Fair Missoula is probably my favorite zone, is because it's not only because of its aesthetics, but also because of the bosses that are there. Like, you have Beast Clergyman and Malekith, but you also have Dragon Lord Placidusax. Some of the most visually stunning boss fights in the entire game. Malekith being the harder of the two, mostly because of his destined death mechanic, but also because of just the sheer amount of damage and how fast he is. Placidusax has a different set of problems.
Kind of.
I'm gonna steal Maxor's line from his Blood and Fire video he did for Elden Ring recently. It's the most diabetic boss in the game. It doesn't like to move around very much. Placidusax literally just does kind of sit there and take damage.
Of boss frequency may have been a couple of days prior, and the last act of the game is just a very awkwardly paced segment. That, and it's maybe even borderline exhausting depending on how many fights you decide to do back to back. Like, even if you do non-mandatory fights in the more open world regions, the frequency at which you encounter them is still way lower than the late game of Elden.
Unless you save quit, you're going to be attacked by Draconic Tree Sentinel's lightning strikes while you're fighting Beast Clergyman. I don't think they've ever fixed that. So it's better to just kill him. Just kill the DTS that's out there.
Ring. You essentially get the Godskin duo, immediately followed by...
I fucking forgot about Godskin duo, dude. I was wondering which boss I was forgetting. Godskin duo.
The Tree Sentinel on the bridge, then the Beast Clergyman that turns into Malekith, right after you fight Sir Gideon Ofnir, followed immediately by Godfrey, first Elden Lord, then Hoarah, then literally Radagon and Elden Beast directly after, and possibly even Malenia somewhere in that mix.
I would have fought Malenia before that. Generally, by the time I get finished with Altus, I'm generally comfortable go and fight Malenia and Moog after that. Unless I'm doing a challenge run.
I understand why they did this, though. They had to catalyze the late game into something approximating a consistent path. You know, whether you're in any of the late game regions, you're getting the last materials to upgrade your weapons, like ancient smithing stones and whatnot. They sort of expect...
I'm so glad fucking the Convergence mod changed the names for these, because... look at how ridiculous of a title this is. Somber Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone. Say it 3 times fast. Somber Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone. Somber Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone. Somber Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone. It's just a ridiculously long title for an upgrade material. I'm glad they changed it to Somber Ancient Stone in the convergence.
Your progression to be completed here, roughly, besides leveling up occasionally through runes at a certain point. I get the game has to come to a close somewhere, but this last part I feel is like so rushed.
You're not going to get very many levels at that point in the game, because unless you're using the golden scarab and gold pickle foul feet, you're not going to get very many runes. Because generally you're going to be in the 50 to 60,000s per level.
You don't even really get to appreciate the world as it is now with the Erd Tree burning and how that changes the entire world of Elden Ring and how it's totally altered. I do really like the third act of the game for the most part. All I'm saying is it's kind of strangely paced, especially when you're so used to being hyper-exploratory from the past, 90% of the game. It's a very strange design to the late game, but it is still pretty fun in its own right. It is worth mentioning that even though the game does end here when it comes to the final boss encounter and ending cinematic, Elden Ring does still allow you to go back and explore the world after or fight any bosses that you may have missed.
Yes.
Granted, you'll probably be way out-leveled for most of them at this point, but the option is always there. Now, I know what everyone's waiting for. How do I feel about the bosses in Elden Ring? This is debatably the entire crux of the game when boiled down, and in some sense, people would argue the reason to buy the game. And I have a lot of words to say about some of these. Some of the bosses are genuinely amazing and masterclasses in terms of fun, enjoyment, and design. And some are so poorly executed that it makes the garbage pile sitting in my trash can look good. So with that said, let's talk about the bosses in Elden Ring.
Please, which one are we talking about first? It's the best part of the soundtrack right there.
Margit the Fell Omen is most likely the first real roadblock the average player will face. And again, without knowing the boss beforehand, Margit is absolutely brutal for an early game boss.
I think he's too hard. For the average player, I think he's way too hard of a first boss. I think Godric should have been the first boss of the game. And you fought Margit after. I really do. I really think that's how it should have been done. You should have fought Godric first. Because Godric is way easier compared to Margit.
Not only are his moves really tricky to deal with, I even think the stage you fight him on is kind of rough. Sure, it's small and easy to understand, so there's not a bunch of room variables you need to pay attention to.
The amount of times that he's knocked me off the edge. Oh, on my first playthrough, that was the only reason he ever killed me, was because we got too close to the edge, and one of his attacks knocked me over, and I didn't have enough poise, and I fell off the side. Too many fucking times, man.
But it's so common to fall off the edges during Margit's fight. In fact, before he was patched, Margit himself could fall off this edge, instantly clearing the boss encounter. But assuming...
Full DS2 style. I love that. I never played the game when that was a thing. I think that was like base game release.
You're facing him normally, how does Margit hold up? His biggest strength as a boss is the fact that he feels almost impossible to beat initially, but you eventually learn his behaviors with enough tries.
He input reads your dodges. He knows which direction you're dodging and reacts with a move accordingly. He's one of the most dynamic bosses in the whole game.
His moves don't do colossal damage by any means, but trying to punish the wrong moves or being a little bit off in your spacing or timing can end up in you getting completely spanked. I also believe Margit does a great job at teaching the player the basics of boss fights per se. You learn to employ all kinds of evasion tactics, whether it be running away, rolling, or jumping, and you get the panic roll behavior beaten out of you pretty quickly, albeit done in kind of a cheap way. One of my biggest issues with Margit, he's well known for the odd timing of his moves, but they feel so artificial and just like, I don't know, manufactured sometimes. His movement is so unnatural and random for the sole purpose of catching you slipping. This goes for, quite a few bosses of Elden Ring, but the wind-up and build-up of a few of these animations that the moves...
I think that's one of the biggest problems with the bosses in these games, is that some of the wind-ups that they have last for so fucking long, is that it's almost impossible to guess when they're going to release them. Like, I also think some of them are random at some points. Like, they can charge up and release anytime their AI wants to.
have, they feel so ridiculous and absurd. You know, like in a cartoon where a character will wind up and spin their fist around really fast before punching someone hard? That's kind of the best way to describe how some Elden Ring's bosses' moves feel. But it's done in that way, not because it adds anything genuinely difficult or natural to the fight, but because it throws a wrench of random into the situation when you're learning it, rather than it just being a more natural and reactive feeling kind of pace. That's really the only big issue.
I can see that being a legitimate criticism. I can understand that.
That I have with Margit, besides a few animations that are hella jank that it looks like you can punish but cannot. I think Margit is a genuinely good starter boss. It teaches brand new players what they need to know going forward, and for the most part, he's fun, fair, and a good challenge every time you take him on, whether in a brand new game or in New Game Plus. Alright, I'm going to say this right here, right now, in front of the whole internet chat room. I think Godric the Grafted, in my opinion, is, he's the second main boss you encounter, and I think he's actually one of the better ones in the game by
True. So true. Thank you. Yeah, I think Godric is one of the best bosses in the game. His design and the way he attacks is on point. 100% FromSoft. I love this boss.
By a long shot. He's a pretty intriguing boss visually, and it's the first time we see somebody in Elden Ring have a first phase and second phase to their fight. He's very intuitive and
it's a very specifically drawn out phase transition too. It's very dramatic. It's very fun. It never gets old to watch.
In terms of how his animations and timings work, it's a lot unlike Margit, where a lot of those feel
you were
unnatural.
supposed to run in.
Godric Phase 1 has pretty telegraphed and straightforward moves to learn and react to. His combo strings can feel like they're a bit longer than Margit's. He's got some different variations of them, so naturally you learn to either run away from them more and use the larger room to your advantage since there's that much more playable space. And again, the timings feel so fluid and responsive, really except this Tornado Axe wind move and then the fire version of that in Phase 2. That's pretty much the only move I'm not in love with. I mentioned earlier that
yeah, I'm not really sure I understand the tracking of that move either. Sometimes you can stand completely still and he'll just miss you with that wind attack or the fire version of that attack. I don't understand it at all. I don't understand the tracking because it's so fucking weird.
His combo strings have a lot of paths in which they can go, so this means that the fight never gets too repetitive or like muscle memory dependent. His Phase 2 moves can be a little controversial, but in general, I like the switch up the Dragon Arm provides. I don't love every element of it, but it gives you a little more incentive to kind of get aggressive and stay closer to him so that he doesn't just keep boxing you out with ranged attacks and fire moves. He might take you a good few tries to get the hang of and learn the way that his Phase 1 and 2 actually, the moveset differs and operates, but once it clicks, this is a super fun boss and mechanically sound as well. I think he's a little easier than Margit, and maybe that's due to the nature of his actual design, or maybe it's the player feeling a little more comfortable and skilled, or
It's several different things. It's the player feeling more confident. It's the fact that you're stronger at the end of Stormveil than when you are at the start. Because Stormveil is absolutely massive. Stormveil is one of the best locations in the entire game. You want to explore everything. There's even parts of Stormveil that I've just never seen. Like, I've explored Stormveil a little bit, but I've never been through all of it. There's certain areas and items that I've just never gotten. But also, I think Godric is also designed as a much easier boss than Margit by a pretty decent margin.
I don't really know, but my only real issue is, this is going to sound petty, but the only thing holding back the Godric fight in my eyes is the atmosphere. While it's Stormveil Castle, just generally what the visual, style looks like, to me it's not different enough from Margit's fight to feel that it's like meaningfully something else. But his design otherwise, visually and mechanically, feels really balanced and finely tuned, and I think it's a very memorable encounter for sure.
I think that's true. What the fuck was that? Sorry about that again. I don't know. I heard something weird in my house, and I wasn't sure what was going on.
For sure. Now, Leone Misbegotten is absolutely not a mandatory fight, but I did want to mention it. So, exploring Castle Morn, you encounter this very aggressive and fast boss wielding a sword, and it drops the weapon that I wanted to use for my Giga Chad strength melee build. But while this fight at first can be incredibly frustrating, it seems like he just doesn't stop swinging, and the timings on his moves can be a little unpredictable and disjointed, and his range is surprisingly good for a sword user along with his aggressive speed. It feels like this fight just suffocates you sometimes and genuinely feels impossible without the right tactic. This causes you to play more safe and passive, which...
No, the strat is to stun him, because after he takes a certain amount of damage, or if you jump attack, generally he'll stun, and that's when you get a second attack in and then get out of the way. You guys have seen how I fight this boss. Like, I generally play very aggressively.
Is the wrong approach with him. You kind of have to fight his aggression with more aggression of your own,
yes,
since he can be quite easily hit stunned. This boss teaches you that your general playstyle will have to adapt regardless of what the boss is or what it can do and what your build is capable of. You'll need to be flexible in how you can pace yourself in combat. My main issue with Leone Misbegotten is, despite knowing all that, it still feels like Homeboy just pushes an absurd amount of buttons before you even have the chance to retaliate sometimes and get anything started. When we were talking about combat pacing earlier, to me this feels like a good example of, like, you know, in Elden Ring, you can't move fast enough, you don't have enough resources, and you can't act on those fast enough to be able to respond with anything before he's done attacking. It can be downright infuriating at times, but it's definitely doable with the right approach and well-placed aggression. I'm not in love with the play space of this location either. It's not that it's too small, I just don't like all the small random obstacles that are in the way.
I think that's a problem with a lot of the boss arenas, is that there's too many obstacles to get stuck on.
Especially, they can be very annoying in this fight when navigating around such sweeping hitboxes. That's really about it. I think it's a pretty average to good-ish fight in Elden Ring, if you ask me, but nothing like extremely top tier. I also want to quickly touch on Renala's boss fight, since I completely missed it my first time around. Admittedly, I don't have that much to say about this fight other than it's conceptually very unique. So this is the first fight.
If I remember correctly, this was a boss fight idea that they've had since Dark Souls 3. Because it was part of the cut content that was in Dark Souls 3. The Rosalia room in Dark Souls 3. I didn't find it in my first playthrough. I showed it off in my Convergence playthrough because I found it. But there was supposed to be a big boss fight in that room, and I think it was supposed to be very much this kind of boss fight, but they had to cut it. So I think this has been a boss fight they've been trying to make for a long time.
Fight where you need to meet some kind of precondition before you deal damage to the actual boss. And like Margit, if you don't already know what you're doing, it can take you by surprise if you're not really paying attention. She spawns a bunch of like COD zombies crawlers that are all yapping away while you need to find and kill one specific yellow glowing one a couple of times, and doing this will break her shield and lower her to the ground where she becomes vulnerable. After defeating her in this stage, she has a second form in which the room completely changes to this like really cool liminal space looking infinity ocean where it's just you, her, and the moon. Aesthetically, one of the coolest fights in the game, but mechanically nothing too complex or anything to write home about. She tends toward...
It's a magic casting boss. Like, it's not going to be super fantastic.
Towards heavy magic attacks, and that can be pretty easily avoided, and she's also quite vulnerable to damage. Renala is not a super difficult fight, nor is she like crazy memorable for her mechanics, but the atmosphere alone makes this boss fight worth pursuing in my opinion. And it's also worth noting that Renala does let you reset stats or change your entire build mid-game if you want to.
That's the only reason why I think Renala is mandatory, is because it opens up respec. But at the same time, if you know what you're doing, you never need respec.
It's a weird mechanic this late in the game, but I suppose it's kind of neat to do. Now, the Magma Worm is a completely optional boss fight in Elden Ring, but the weird part is you're likely going to encounter him first in a small dungeon in Caelid, just as regular Magma Worm, before you actually find the real, like, original one, or at least I did multiple times anyways, and that can kind of dampen his impact. The boss is more a visual spectacle with one lesson rather than some kind of intricate boss. You learn pretty quickly that the Magma Worm can be heavily damaged when striking the head more so than the body, but sticking too close to the head is where you're really in its threat range and most of the devastating attacks come from. He looks a lot...
Their lava attack is bullshit. I'm gonna say it. I think the lava on the ground doing more damage than the boss can do is bullshit.
Scarier than he really is, but it's a good fight to give the player, you know, something that really lets them feel how much progress they've made so far and everything they've overcome. I will admit it's kind of annoying how many times this boss gets reused and repeated in different areas. It really detracts from the charm and specialness that the first one is supposed to have. It's a somewhat one-dimensional boss mechanically.
Uh-oh. Did my internet die? That would be a yes.
Specialness.
Give me 1 second. I'll fix it. Okay, I think we're good.
That the first one is supposed to.
Oh god, no. It's probably because I'm not watching it at a set quality.
Have. It's a somewhat one-dimensional boss mechanically speaking, but I guess it's a nice softball that they throw you before some of the really tough ones hit you later in the game. Next up is the big man himself, Star Scourge Radahn. This is a fight that really defines what Elden Ring is and genuinely has some of the coolest visuals, atmosphere, and mechanics of any boss fight. You can absolutely do this one solo, but the fight is clearly meant thematically for you to summon your allies and charge at him from across this massive battlefield.
I disagree, but at the same time, that's just because I did the boss fight with the summons one time, and then never again. Because I prefer to fight Radahn with just him and me, because his moveset is so fun.
This is the biggest playable boss space in Elden Ring, maybe besides Fire Giant, and it's kind of necessary both from a thematic perspective and just practically. Radahn is a very active boss, and he kind of has like, you know, 3 phases, or I guess he has like phase 1, 1.5, and then phase 2. So he's very different, and he moves around quite frequently. And
phase 2 for Radahn is when he buffs his swords with Cragblade. Because that allows him to do his meteor attack. The reason why I don't consider his meteor attack a phase is because he can do the meteor attack multiple times if you take too long.
His moves are pretty damn powerful. In fact, Radahn got nerfed in a patch shortly after the game came out. Radahn still got it all, however. He's fast, powerful.
They unnerfed him recently in one of the previous patches. But in Convergence, Radahn is stronger than base game. I know for a fact. He's so much more fun to fight when he does more damage and when he has more health.
Powerful, got quick acting moves, and a couple of like wild gimmick moves that could one-shot you if you're not being careful. However, he is very vulnerable to punishes once you understand his entire threat range and cooldown on his moves, which can take some time. He's sort of the opposite of Magma Worm, where it's not as dangerous as he looks, but Radahn is as dangerous as he appears to be. One flaw, in my opinion, though, is that this fight can be really suboptimal for melee-based builds, especially considering how erratic he moves and his really large hitbox.
I disagree, but continue.
So, to counteract this, you do get access to Torrent throughout this fight, which is one of the few times you actually get to utilize him in a boss fight in Elden Ring, period.
Which is a damn fucking shame.
Radahn is one of the most...
Because I think some of these boss fights with these giant arenas were designed with Torrent in mind, and they just cut him. They cut the use of Torrent out of the game for him. And it's so unfortunate. Radahn, Fire Giant, you can use it for Radahn and Fire Giant, and I can't think of any other ones.
iconic boss fights in the entire game. Its build-up is just so unforgettable, since it's like this big ritual and ceremony that prepares for it. You get to see the battlefield with, like, out any enemies. It's very different, and the lead-up of this just makes it so grandiose and important feeling. It also opens up an entire new area of the map once he's defeated. Radahn is not my favorite boss in the game personally, but he's definitely one of them. He's extremely high tier for me in the context of all the rest.
Radahn is an S tier boss, period. He is one of the most important and one of the best designed bosses in the whole game. I fucking love Radahn. I love the spectacle of the Radahn Festival. I love his moveset, and I love the impact on the story that he has.
Originally, I wasn't going to include him in this video, but I actually do want to discuss Elmer of the Briar. He's kind of out of the way to find, and it's interesting at first because you expect that he's a swordie. You know, you just find openings.
The telekinetic sword move is so fucking...
and punish accordingly and just keep out of his threat range. But then you quickly find out that don't work, because he literally starts throwing his sword around the room with magic, and the room isn't that big to begin with, so you don't have many choices. It's dangerous to be far away.
He also has the best legendary weapon in the whole game.
And up close. But you learn the tactic, more or less, is to get in between him and his sword for the biggest punishes. He's not the most memorable boss or anything, but he challenges you in a way in which you kind of have to forget everything you thought you knew about sword users in Elden Ring so far. It's a fun one to do, and it's actually one of the more, like, underrated bosses in my opinion.
Absolutely.
But we finally make it to Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, aka Lord of Riz.
Fuck yeah, dude.
I think Rykard is visually one of the most special and unique bosses in Elden Ring.
This is Yorm on steroids.
But also, this is a gimmick fight to some degree, and the weapon you get for this fight only works in this particular encounter. As much as I love Rykard thematically and even the gimmick weapon behind it, I can't honestly say that this one is flawless. Just like many others, Rykard has two phases. In phase 1, most of Rykard's moves feel fair and pretty reasonable. You know, they are very snappy, but you get used to them at a certain point. The only one that I do not like in this fight is this ground wave that was consistently one-shotting me. And as far as I can tell, there's actually no way to avoid this move.
There is a way. It's just really fucking difficult to pull off. It's the same thing as waterfowl, is you have to do a specific set of inputs to be able to dodge it. And if you can't, you die if you don't have enough vigor or armor. The fact that he's using Bernal's set, which is one of the best sets early game, and he's getting one shot, tells me that that's a big vigor check.
It's guaranteed damage. Even if you roll, you still lose like half health. So this move was an absolute nightmare for me to deal with, and revealed to me that I was absurdly underleveled. Also, the arena is somewhat clunky. There's times where the boss can get so aggressive that it pushes itself up against the literal spawn door wall, just trapping me in it, and I was actually unable to move. But aside from a few bad mechanics, phase 1 feels pretty fun and fair. It's phase 2 that I think has a bunch of missteps.
Yeah.
Rykard gets his sword this time, and because the scale of this enemy, sometimes it's really difficult to track the path of his sword, especially considering he has quite a long and unnatural windup on this move.
Just stand in the lava. It's not a big deal. That's literally how I started fighting Rykard after a while. I just stopped using Serpent Hunter, and I just started using a bleed or a frostbite weapon, and just started going ham. Because you can get enough health regen that completely negates the lava damage, and you can just fucking spam attacks while you're underneath the boss. It's not that big of a deal, but at the same time, and that's mostly because his attacks are so fucking wonky that you can't even tell what he's doing sometimes. And then there's a move that I'm sure he's going to talk about next.
Move as well. But the worst thing by far in this fight are these red skulls that he spawns. This wouldn't be so bad if they didn't track so heavily and you could maneuver these a little bit more, or you didn't have to burn so many resources in order to avoid them. It's like you have two choices. You either, just eat the damage, or you run out of stamina and then get hit with the sword, since Rykard can keep pushing buttons even after all of these skulls are in play, and they take forever to finally subside. With how long the windup on the Serpent Hunter weapon can really take, it's almost a death sentence to get hit by even just one of these skulls. Despite all that, I really like this fight for the most part. The premise and visuals are spectacular, and even though it's kind of a gimmicky fight and it has some really jank mechanics, it doesn't feel like the game is giving you a free win necessarily either. Just a couple of whack things can seriously dampen the experience or your enjoyment of this one. But overall, the pace is pretty consistent throughout, and he's by no means the best, but another pretty damn good main boss that's very well done in Elden Ring. Morgott is the second, or I guess rather third appearance of Margit. There is a spot in the game where he's just a normal enemy in Altus Plateau, which is really weird to be honest, but in any case, Morgott has some key distinctions that make him a totally different boss than Margit to handle.
The tarnished who gets no bitches and stacks no paper.
Firstly, he has much more tools and active moves to work with. There's much more space in this arena as well, thus he moves around a lot more. And he also has a second phase switch up. The things I really enjoy about Morgott are the fact that he feels like he's testing everything you learned since Margit up to that point, and on how much you've improved both as a literal player and as well as...
Oh my god, are you serious? Dude, is my internet just gonna not work today? What is happening?
Your character. He still works on the same principles, he's meant to test your timing, catch panic rolling, etc., but this time with a few new tricks up his sleeve. He also has pretty good and clear animations when trying to know what's punishable and what isn't. Not perfect ones, mind you, but they are pretty stellar. This fight can also feel incredibly rewarding to learn as you keep playing. You can absolutely feel yourself getting better and better with each attempt. However, some of his moves still do feel overly windy, really unnatural, and just have odd timing for no real reason other than to catch you pushing buttons or something dumb. And, you learn it a couple times, not because it goes with the flow of the fight, but just because that's how they programmed it. And the worst thing of all, the amount of buttons that this man can push without taking a break is beyond absurd. Like, he starts combos, and I could go and get a whole university degree, but before he's done with his combo moves.
Oh, are you gonna show?
Do this quick and easy. Bro, I really got hit by that? Throwing out a lot of moves, man. I gotta do something. And here he goes. All right, this is gonna be a little while. Now, we got some time to kill, and I got a lot of stuff I need to do.
Oh, dude, you're drinking the boomer juice?
In the workforces of many of the advanced democracies that have been...
And in how every one of us is called on to adapt throughout our lives.
Alright, it's been a while. He should finally be done with this combo. Finally, there's an opening.
These foolish ambitions to rest.
But all in all, though, I think Morgott is an enhanced and maybe slightly more interesting Margit. I know it's not the best designed, and Morgott does have a few issues, but personally, it's one of the more enjoyable fights to me, in my opinion, and I always have a great time playing it. Now, my brother in Christ, let me shoot straight with you on this. The Fire Giant is essentially the epitome of the dullness of the snowy region itself. It's conceptually a lot like the Radahn fight in terms of scale, just with way less attention to detail and style. The scale of the arena, like I said, is pretty similar. It's an actual oversized giant enemy, and you do have access to torrent, so they are similar in that sense, but Fire Giant basically just moves in these really long motions very frequently, so you're always chasing him down throughout the fight. Radahn's a bit more erratic, but generally stays engaged in combat. Fire Giant plays a lot more like of a retreat sort of play, and in Fire Giant's second phase, he pretty much loses all vulnerable spots. He has like one right on the back of his ankle in phase 1, but that's really it. You kind of just have to chip away at him over and over again until he reaches 0. This fight I actually found to be one of the easiest in the game upon repeat playthroughs. His moves are basically all or nothing. If you get hit by something in phase 1 or 2, it's likely game over almost right away, but they're quite telegraphed and easy to react to. Main problem with Fire Giant is, like, sure, he works as intended. I just find him so insufferably boring and dull, which is odd considering this boss is the conclusion of the entire open world format in second act. Not the biggest fan of Fire Giant, but he's alright, I suppose. Oh my god, I really have to talk about this fight, don't I? Lord forgive me, as I am about to have a gamer moment. Honestly, I feel like I've been pretty nice and fair to the Elden Ring bosses so
Besides Fire Giant, I think you've been fair. This boss was a mistake. I'm just gonna let him talk about it. I don't want to talk about it.
So far, you know, while I have my critiques of them, there is no boss in Elden Ring that I despise more than the Godskin duo. And it's beyond me how anyone thought players were gonna enjoy this boring trash. Now, let me be clear, I really like both the Godskin Noble and the Apostle on their own. In their individual encounters, they're usually pretty okay.
They are really fun to fight one-on-one. I'd say Skinny is a lot easier than Fatty. But Fatty has the most telegraphed attacks. Skinny in phase 2 is probably by far the easiest, and that's why, because you could just burn him down before he does anything of importance.
But putting them together in one fight goes together worse than EDP 445 and Cupcakes. And if you
I was actually watching because I saw that EDP was caught messaging more minors again, and I was like, Jesus Christ, this dude just doesn't quit. So I was watching a video recapping the whole EDP 445 situation. I haven't finished it yet because I had to sit down and do reacts, but good God, that was a good one.
If you don't get that reference, good. That's probably for the best. So,
I've been on the internet too much. I get that reference.
In the Godskin duo fight, you take on Ben Affleck from a Marvel movie and a fat ass. But let's think about the fight. You take on Ben Affleck.
Dude, that's Christian Bale.
Affleck from a Marvel movie and a fat ass. But let's think about this for a second, though. Typically, any duo boss fight in a game is essentially one entity or boss that's split into two. Throwing two fully capable bosses at the player is so clearly unfair. Even FromSoft would know, to account for this. And in prior games, they've done, fights like the Ornstein and Ch0pper.
FromSoft perfected the double boss fight long before Elden Ring was ever a concept. Ornstein and Ch0pper is one of the most perfect boss dynamics in gaming, period. You want another example? How about the twin princes, Lorien and Lothric? They were perfect. It was beautifully done. Godskin Duo is one of the most tarnished, is one of the biggest blemishes on FromSoft's reputation I have ever seen in terms of boss design. It is so completely unacceptable with how they designed the boss that I can't even believe it made it into the game. It's like a beta placeholder. It's almost DS2 levels of bullshit, all right? It's so awful.
fight, which was actually relatively balanced and very similar in its conception to this fight. However, it's like with Godskin Duo, they forgot to take their brain medication and, you know, forgot all the principles that make a fight like this work. Or even in other video games entirely, you know, one boss is generally split into two things. That's like very simple concept. Games have done that forever, and they have largely different attributes in terms of speed and power, or they have strengths that cover the other's vulnerability and etc. Once again, great example is the Ornstein and Ch0pper fight in Dark Souls 3, and that's a good example.
Dude, that was Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 3 is Lorien and Lothric. He probably misspoke. It's fine.
Of how to do a concept like this. It's also like Pyra and Mithra in Smash Brothers. Mithra is super fast and agile, but lighter and does way less damage. Pyra is way slower than Mithra, but she's a bit heavier and she hits like my ex-wife. You know, that's just typically the concept that games like to go for, but instead of cutesy anime girls, the Godskin Duo are old, decrepit, disgusting men with no clear attribute differences. In fact, the big man himself is like...
Please tell me you do not have the Baldurkin's Blessing on, because that's what this is. That's this health debuff that he's got going on. Please tell me you don't have that on.
Faster than the Squidward-looking fellow. Anything you think is punishable is immediately struck down, as the other one will guard the recovery window. And if you do happen to get a punish in, especially on the big one, he'll do this almost unreactable belly move that causes you to trade hits so much. The fact that they move at basically the same speed makes them such a nightmare to deal with. It's not like you can really split them up and take them one-on-one. Oh, and let's say you do happen to kill one. They pull from the same health bar, so they'll just respawn after a few seconds. And let's say you kill both at the same time. You know, you would think you would get rewarded for that, you know, for playing optimally. Nothing happens, though. You're sat there awkwardly waiting for them to come back, and it doesn't reward the player whatsoever for doing this at all. Not to mention the giant roly fat move that Fat Albert over here can do. Technically, you can roll through this, but it's far too risky and inconsistent. And you're just, I guess, supposed to use the pillars to block them until it's over, and just pray to God that the AI doesn't slip past it, or that the other one gets too aggressive while you're waiting. And if you get them below half health, they just go sicko mode and run you down so that you can't even position yourself to retaliate with anything if you wanted to. My God, it's just so bad and boring. This is the only boss encounter in the game that I genuinely dread, and I really don't think it's just a massive case of skill issue. It's almost universal.
It's not a skill issue. It's a game issue. It's a boss design issue. It's a whole other list of things. There is nothing that can prepare a player for boss design like this. It's the same problem with Dark Souls 2. It's not a get good issue. It's a get the specific RNG issue. You either get really lucky or really fucked over. That there's these two extremes that you have to meet the criteria for. And it's one of the reasons why I don't like Dark Souls 2.
Universally agreed upon that this fight is cringe. It's just not good or engaging design for a boss fight, and you'd think this would be a bit closer tuned and examined since it's a literal mandatory boss to beat the game, but this is easily the most unfair and sloppy boss fight in Elden Ring by a country mile. And I was thinking about it, I'm like, how could you improve the Godskin Duo fight? And I was like, you know it'd be really funny? If in the Godskin Duo fight you could with one of the and then you could
okay,
bro. Be even faster. Next up is the good old beast clergyman, who then becomes later Malekith the Black Blade. A fight that can be a little controversial and isn't without its faults, but I think is still relatively fun and solid. We'll start with the Beast Clergyman, and this is his initial form, in which he plays a lot more grounded in a rushdown kind of behavior. His threat range and damage aren't anything insane, but he throws out a lot of attacks and has very little cooldown. This can make it a little deceiving to know when something is actually safe to punish. That, on top of him blatantly reading your controller's inputs and dodging the very second you push a button, you know, to hit something you think is open, and then he just does this move where he chucks rocks at you while putting some space in between you and him. That can be extremely annoying. I do think it's kind of ridiculous how many hitboxes he can throw out in succession and not be punished for it, but his moves are telegraphed and reactable enough. I'm aware a lot of people don't like Beast Clergyman, and I think that's totally fair.
Oh shit.
But personally, I happen to really enjoy this fight a lot for the most part. It probably depends greatly on...
What the fuck happened there?
Personally, I happen to really enjoy this fight a lot.
He clipped into the pillar! I've never seen that happen before.
For the most part. It probably depends greatly on the build you're using. Since Beast Clergyman is rushdown, when he gets to half HP, of course, and he changes to Malekith, he becomes the exact opposite.
It's not quite half,
which is really frustrating. Melee excels against his first phase, but really struggles against Malekith. Malekith is very airborne, acrobatic, and hardly vulnerable for any real time at all. It's definitely doable with a melee build, you just have to wait for a ton of dangerous attacks to wrap up. But clearly, you are meant to play this fight with the Blasphemous Claw item. This heavily stuns Malekith on moves where his sword is glowing yellow. But if you don't have this item or don't know what it does, then good luck. But even if you do, it's by no means obvious how you're supposed to use it. I typically don't bother with this item, but apparently using this makes Malekith a completely different fight and significantly more bearable for melee builds and just in general. I don't love the implementation of this, but both Beast Clergyman and Malekith are still very high tier bosses for me in this game. For this next one, I was wondering if I even consider Sir Gideon Ofnir a main boss.
I think the main problem with your playstyle is you're not staying close enough to the boss. Let me just be honest here. I'm not... Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to play games at all, because it's just that I've noticed that with almost every one of his boss fights that he's shown, and your talisman choice is god awful. You're using the Cerulean Amber Medallion for more FP when you don't need it. You're also using the Godskin swaddling cloth with a weapon that is not something you're going to be hitting an enemy multiple times with, because the drain on your stamina is too much.
Boss in Elden Ring, but I suppose since he is mandatory and he has some interesting mechanics and properties, he's worth discussing. The thing about his moveset is that he's really all magic based, and this ends up meaning that if you respect his moves too much, he's just going to keep you boxed out and get momentum. If you let bro cook for too long, he just gets going, and this will eventually drown you out and overwhelm the player with magic. The key to success in this fight is just completely disrespecting any button he pushes right as it begins. Just simply reacting to anything he does and preventing it is the easiest way to win this boss fight. He's not super complex or intricate, he only has a handful of moves to deal with anyways.
It depends on how many bosses you kill, because the more remembrance bosses that you beat, the more attacks that Gideon will have.
But I really think he's a nice change of pace coming after the exhausting and embarrassing Godskin duo and the relative difficulty of Malekith. It's a decently fun fight for what it is that just requires a certain level of confidence to really bring it home consistently. Walk just 100 feet up the stairs after defeating Sir Gideon and you're going to run into Godfrey First Elden Lord. Now, technically this isn't the first time we see this homie, as we did fight him in the capital as the Golden Shade version of Godfrey, and also without his persona. But the actual Godfrey fight near the end is a bit of an odd one. He also has two phases, Godfrey and Hoarah.
Technically, he has 4 phases. I would consider Godfrey a 4-phase fight, because even though 2 of the phases are similar to each other, because you have regular Godfrey, and then he goes all cloudy, I would say. And then he has big AoE moves that he does as Godfrey, then he turns into Horaloo, and then he does the same thing as Horaloo.
I really like the Godfrey fight significantly more. His moves are devastating, but they have learnable combos and clearly punishable windows. This fight is, very give and take, and I feel like you get greatly rewarded for playing this one well and making the right decisions. It feels like it's very much in your favor and you have agency. Unfortunately, both him and Horaloo have some crazy and almost comically long windups on a bunch of their moves, and it just looks goofy and unnatural at
This transition. This is his transition into his Phase 2.
times, especially in Phase 2. Horaloo is easily exploitable, has some unbelievably annoying moves, and just isn't nearly as fun or engaging as
Oh, you're using Scarlet Rot. I mean, he has had Rotten Breath on his bar this whole time, and I just haven't really called it out. Dude!
Godfrey. I mean, you do fight him in the same arena as Morgott, the Elden Throne, which is cool. You've been in here before, but to me, this fight ends up being just sort of average. A lot of people find this boss fight to be anticlimactic or just somewhat underwhelming, considering it's the fight before the literal end of the game. It leaves something to be desired, and I really do agree with that.
I don't. I think Godfrey's an amazing boss.
At some point, we had to get around to talking about her. Easily the most difficult and potentially controversial boss fight in all of Elden Ring, Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is very special because she's quite out of the way to get to begin with. She's not a mandatory boss, and you really need to jump through a lot of hoops to fight her anyway.
I think a lot of people who are upset that Malenia is as difficult as she is are some of the hardcore players who refuse to not do everything. Me. But also, I think her waterfowl dance is fucking bullshit. I know how to dodge it now, but it's bullshit for the average player. I don't understand why they made her so difficult.
Anyways, but here's the thing. I really like Malenia as a boss. She's one of my favorite in the game, but I cannot honestly say that FromSoft didn't go too far in a few places.
I think this is the boss that they went too far with. I think they should have saved Malenia as a DLC boss, because I think that's the kind of difficulty that should be in. The DLC should be where the most difficult bosses are at, but instead you have Mohg and Malenia in the base game, and it makes me very, very, very afraid of how difficult the bosses are going to be in Shadow of the Erd Tree.
I get the whole idea of wanting to make one boss in the game a clear notch above virtually anything else difficulty-wise and make it interesting, but Malenia starts to cross the line of what is considered to be fair or balanced very heavily. Malenia has essentially two main mechanics that make her an absolute menace to deal with. The first is lifesteal, so every time she lands a hit on you, she gets some of her life back. This wouldn't be so bad if there was ways to really counteract this across all builds. Like, for example, and I don't understand this at all, blocking Malenia's attacks with a shield still grants her HP back and puts you at risk of getting your guard broken. There is no point in using a shield that, you may have spent the entire game leveling up. Also, lifesteal works even when you trade hits. And secondly, her other mechanic is she turns into Sephiroth and starts using Octaslash. It's called Waterfowl Dance, but it's easier to say and it's basically the same thing. And the thing is, in Phase 1, Malenia will typically do an Octaslash twice, before and after you get her below 50% health. The thing is, in most cases, Octaslash is pretty much Malenia just choosing to win the game. And if you don't start running away the very frame that it starts up, you're pretty much not getting out of it. And remember, of course, she gets health back from this. And in Phase 2, Malenia will just Octaslash at any point she wants. No rhyme or reason for it at all.
It's one of the most RNG heavy attacks I've ever seen. And it is possible to dodge. It's just so incredibly difficult that it's not even worth learning.
Not predictable, and you're at the mercy of the AI. In my opinion, this is a little too much. I think giving her lifesteal or Octaslash is fair, not both. Also, not to mention, this fight does reward you, with punishing her aggression. She can be easily hit-stunned, but she also has super armor on a ton of moves that even if you successfully punish something you were going to get hit by and, you deflected that, you're going to get hit with the next one, or an Octaslash since you got too close and you now don't have time to run away. I understand a lot of people will literally just say skill issue, bro, have a bigger brain and just get better, but it's like this fight's optimal amount of challenge without feeling unnecessarily unfair just really isn't there.
No, it's not. It's not a skill issue at all. There are a lot of ways to cheese Melania with frostbite and stuff. It's still insanely difficult. I think Melania should have been a DLC boss.
I love this fight in almost all other aspects. I just think it's a little too far over the top, and there's some stuff I just can't defend. It's a challenge, sure, but one where you're praying the AI is merciful on you and doesn't octoslash too much, or just praying you don't get hit by it even if she does. Those are my major issues with Melania. I mean, she is a solid boss.
No, Melania is a very good boss. I just think she's way too difficult for what the main game is specifically. Because she's just such a high skill ceiling in terms of the fight. A lot of her other moves are very fair and very telegraphed and very easy to maneuver around or dodge or parry. But the problem is, even if you manage to parry her, you have to parry her 3 times to get a riposte. And that is just insane. It's the same thing with Radagon. You have to parry him 3 times. And the problem with parrying Radagon is he can use his grab attack immediately when you parry him. And Radagon can parry your spells and other attacks too. Pretty much anything that's a projectile, Radagon can parry it.
But it's clear they can't help themselves and show a little restraint when making her, which is not a compliment. All in all, a fun boss, but a good example of just going a little bit too far in the extreme direction just for the sake of it, and it's not for the best in my opinion.
Also, I know I don't like to talk about this very much, but I think there was also it opened up a big can of worms for these stupid-ass Kotaku and other places to talk to push their issues with feminism and stuff, making Melania the hardest boss and shit like that. I think those people are pathetic who have to push those issues over a video game. But at the same time, if you don't want to fight this boss, you don't have to.
Now, the final main boss battle in Elden Ring is a 2-parter against Radagon and then Elden Beast.
Radagon. He is easily the greatest boss in the entire game. He is the #1, in my opinion. He is the boss of the game. He is such a fun fucking fight.
I think the fact that you have to beat both in succession really hurts this one, but I'll get to that. I'm just going to say it, Radagon is easily one of the best bosses in Elden Ring in my opinion. Maybe even my favorite on a good day. Elden Beast, not so much, and I could be wrong here, but I think the thought process behind this boss duo was that you have the mechanically interesting and intricate boss fight in Radagon. Sure, the visuals aren't anything spectacular, it's actually kind of an ugly looking arena, but mechanically, the fight is incredible. Then you get to Elden Beast, which is the total opposite, a grand visual spectacle, but mechanically very dull and slow. I suppose I get the approach for that, but realistically, its execution has some holes. I'll begin with Radagon. Now, what I really love about this fight is how the flow and dance is established right away. His animations are so crisp and well done that telegraphing his moves never feels too one-sided or unfair. Now, Radagon can push a lot of buttons, which is, can be a problem. It's the same issue that a lot of Elden Ring bosses have. He drains your resources before you get to Elden Beast at all, which is probably the biggest detriment as it relates to him specifically. But finding the rhythm of this fight and finding the right way to respond to each move is just...
It doesn't feel forced whenever you are trying to find the rhythm of this boss fight. It doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel any sort of like it's pushing you to be in one direction. The flow of the fight just comes to you so naturally that it makes this boss fight feel so fucking good to fight. And I can't praise the design of Radagon enough for all of his attacks. They're all thematically and mechanically just, it's just chef kiss perfect.
Just so satisfying. There's a few moves that just drive me crazy though. Like the wind up on his grab or whatever just looks so stupid, and it has that just overly delayed wind up that I'm so over. And also the punish opportunities of some of the moves. He can do this like single golden ray that comes out so fast, it's debatable whether you can even avoid this consistently or not. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but still, that can be frustrating. But in any case, Radagon's fight still feels like a consistent dance and a give and take where precision and good timing is greatly rewarded. Such a mechanically excellent fight, but the problem is, once you beat that, you go on to Elden Beast. And this one, I don't have quite as much praise for. This is gonna sound kind of funny, but one of the core issues for me is the literal design of this character. I get it's supposed to be the amalgamation of chaos and the unknown incarnate in monster form, but to me, Elden Beast isn't scary or intimidating looking. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. Like, it's kind of cute. It looks like a squishy fish kind of animal with its, like, adorable little one eye. I don't really get unknown terror vibes from this one.
I think they were trying to throw in a little eldritch horror, and they kind of went in the wrong direction.
More just like squishy space fish.
He's a big whale. He's a giant whale with arms and legs. And he's not very difficult. When I finish my rune level 1 run, this is the boss that I'm not worried about beating at all.
And the cuteness holds Elden Beast back from being as grandiose as he probably should be. But the visuals are where the problems just begin. This fight and pacing is a slow and boring disaster. The amount of running and waiting you need to do back and forth in the arena just grinds the pace of combat to a near halt. The moment you successfully evade a sequence of moves, you should get rewarded for that and, get in striking distance, and as soon as you do, he just goes away to the other side. Elden Beast to me feels much like a test of skill, more so a test of patience, since the fight is unbearably slow, and you need to keep beating Radagon to get here if you fail. I don't know if I really want to call Elden Beast a bad fight, it's just clearly got some gaps and flaws. There's a theory that Torrent was supposed to be usable in this fight,
yes,
similar to how it was in Radahn and the Fire Giant, but for whatever reason, this just isn't the case. Even Elden Beast's moveset feels like it was compatible for play with Torrent. He's got this one move called like Elden Stars or whatever, where these things come out, and it's pretty much unavoidable damage. Probably won't kill you, but it feels like you should be able to avoid this in somehow. And then also this giant ring, this feels like you need Torrent to jump over it, or not need him, but you know what I mean. It feels like you should be able to have this. Basically, everything in this fight screams at me that something else needed. There was another component that was supposed to be in this fight.
It's a fight that's not finished, if you want me to be perfectly honest. I think Elden Beast is absolutely not finished. It's as close to finished as they could get it, but it's not finished.
That just isn't at play, so it just really feels like something's missing. But whatever the case may be, Elden Beast is still somewhat anticlimactic as a boss fight, both visually and mechanically in my eyes. The first time you beat Elden Beast is sure to be a rush, but upon replaying it, you can really feel the hollowness of the design of, this particular ending. Needless to say, there's countless other bosses in Elden Ring, all with their own different variants, appearances, mechanics, and abilities. Given the insane range of Elden Ring's boss variety, the game is still too big to effectively use them all without having a bunch of copy-paste repeats. The world's scale and size was maybe just a little overzealous in comparison to the enemy variety they could realistically include in it. But again, as I stated earlier, I think this is largely a problem for people who take the game a bit more seriously than the average gamer. Most people may not even notice these issues, to be honest, but for me personally, the bosses have so much depth and variety that I can deal with some repeats or a few of the less fun ones occasionally. It's extremely clear that many of these more minor bosses in the game didn't get the love or attention to detail that the more integral ones got, but that's to be expected. They had to save on dev time and everything, and I can understand why that was the case.
Yeah.
For being the main selling point of the game in a way, all in all, the bosses are still easily the most charming part of Elden Ring and will remain iconic and enjoyable for decades to come. I am absolutely sure of it.
Absolutely. I agree.
Elden Ring as a total experience is completely impossible to encapsulate in just one YouTube video. You have an actual very fresh and new innovative take on what it means to be an open world game, and I guarantee will change the direction of that genre of games forever going forward. It will always be regarded as one of those innovative games of our generation, and while not perfect, once again, the amount of value you get out of that aspect alone makes Elden Ring arguably worth the price tag and then some. But then on top of the massive boss variety, the technical and mechanical beauty of them, and the game's sheer style and aesthetic, Elden Ring shifted the landscape of gaming for good. A title of this magnitude is going to have its faults, its shortcomings, or otherwise personal gripes you may experience. But putting this experience into perspective with some of the other awful trash that gets released with the exact same price tag is almost unreal. I really do believe that despite all the criticisms I and many others have for the title itself.
For example, let's use Starfield. Starfield is a almost unplayable and buggy mess, and it's almost $100 for one of the packages to buy it. The fact that they have the balls to release an unfinished product for that much money is ridiculous. It is... I'm not going to talk about that right now.
Its imperfections are part of the experience. Elden Ring came out at a time where games were in desperate need of a refresher, and this was so novel and different to the palate, which is why I think it captured everyone's attention in the way that it did. Mark my words, 5 to 10 years from now, people are going to look at Elden Ring with such reverence and nostalgia, and with that, you'll know what kind of impact it had on them after first experiencing Elden Ring in its complete and masterful form.
They're going to look at it the same way they look at the Dark Souls trilogy. It's just one of those things that you can't encapsulate it. As he said, you can't encapsulate it in one video because it's so massively different from everything else that's come before it that I think, yeah, people will look back on Elden Ring in the future as one of the most defining video games to have come out this decade. I don't know. Plus, I fucking love the game. It's literally, it's one of my favorite games of all time. And I've never... A lot of the shortcomings and problems that are in all the copy-paste stuff and stuff like that, I've learned to look past it because I can see the potential of what can be in the future. But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. I don't know. It was fun. It was fun to hear someone else's perspective on it.